In a dimly lit courtroom, where tension hung thick in the air, all eyes were on a middle-aged judge with a stern face, known for his notoriously harsh rulings. This was Judge Henry Carter, a man whose name carried weight in the justice system. He was famous not just for his legal knowledge, but for his swift, unforgiving sentences. To him, there were no bloodlines, no room for mercy. In Judge Carter's world, people were either guilty or innocent, with nothing in between. But beneath his confident exterior, a hidden bias often tainted his judgments, a bias he kept hidden behind a polished mask of righteousness. Today, however, he was facing a case that seemed routine, yet unexpectedly stirred a nerve in him. The defendant was a young black woman named Alicia Summers. From the moment she stepped into the courtroom, Judge Carter's eyes narrowed. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, a sense of calm that unsettled him. Alicia wore a simple dress, her hands clasped calmly in front of her, as if she held secrets no one else could know. She didn't look afraid, and that only seemed to bother the judge more. He felt an unexplainable urgency to show her what his courtroom was about. As the prosecutor laid out the accusations detailing a minor offense that would typically warrant a second chance, Judge Carter's mind was already made up. The offense seemed trivial to most, hardly deserving of the punishment he was prepared to hand down. But something in Alicia's poise seemed to challenge him, as if she were silently daring him to see beyond his own prejudice, though she never spoke a word in defiance. Judge Carter cleared his throat and began to address her, each word laced with an authority that left little room for compassion. His voice was icy, his tone final. He listed her supposed failings, pointing to the stereotype he'd already formed in his mind. To him, Alicia represented a world he couldn't control, a world that pushed against the boundaries he carefully built in his courtroom. But as he continued to speak, a faint glimmer of discomfort began to tug at the back of his mind. Something didn't feel quite right. Just as he was about to deliver his sentence, Alicia did something unexpected. She raised her eyes to meet his, her gaze unwavering, unflinching. There was something behind those eyes, a depth, a strength, that made Judge Carter hesitate, if only for a split second. And in that instant, a chilling realization crept over him. He didn't know who she really was, not yet. But he was about to find out, in a way that would shatter everything he thought he knew about justice, fairness, and the very system he'd spent his life defending. With the gavel poised in his hand, Judge Carter's grip tightened, the words of the sentence ready to spill from his lips. But before he could bring it down, an unexpected voice interrupted. A voice that would soon make him question not only this decision, but every judgment he'd ever made. Judge Carter's fingers hovered over the gavel, frozen mid-air, as the voice sliced through the quiet courtroom. It wasn't the usual murmur of lawyers or spectators. No, this voice was steady, commanding even, cutting through the tension like a blade. The judge's gaze shifted to see a tall man in a dark suit rising from the back row. His face was calm, yet his eyes held a fierce determination. He looked directly at Judge Carter, his stare unwavering. It was clear he wasn't a stranger to the courtroom's power dynamics, nor to the judge himself. The man's name was Marcus Hall, a well-respected lawyer and advocate known for his high-profile cases and his dedication to representing those whom society often overlooked. He was a fighter in every sense of the word, standing firm in his beliefs and never backing down from a challenge. Marcus wasn't the type to disrupt a trial unless he had a reason, an important one. Judge Carter felt his pulse quicken. He'd faced Marcus Hall before, but never under circumstances like this. Seeing him there, speaking up for Alicia Summers, shifted the atmosphere. It was clear that Alicia was not just another defendant. She had people who cared about her, people with influence. Marcus didn't sit down as he addressed the judge. Your Honor, before he passed judgment on Miss Summers, I believe there's information about her that should be considered. His voice was low, yet it carried across the courtroom with authority. He held the room's attention as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, his expression barely hiding his irritation. He had made up his mind about Alicia, and Marcus's sudden involvement complicated things. Mr. Hall, if you have something relevant to say, I suggest you get to the point quickly, Judge Carter replied, his tone colder than usual. He didn't want to lose control of his courtroom, not in front of this audience. Marcus didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, his face unreadable, and continued, Miss Summers isn't who you think she is, Your Honor. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The spectators shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. Judge Carter felt a prickling unease at the back of his mind. There was something he was missing, something that didn't add up, and Marcus seemed to know exactly what it was. Alicia, who had been quiet throughout the hearing, looked down, her expression calm but distant, as if she were anticipating this moment. She hadn't asked for Marcus's help, hadn't needed anyone to stand up for her. Yet here he was, seemingly ready to expose a truth about her that Judge Carter hadn't even considered. But what could possibly change his mind? The case was straightforward, or at least he thought it was. But Marcus wasn't finished. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on Alicia, before returning to the judge. Before you decide Miss Summers's future, Your Honor, I urge you to take a closer look at her background, her life, and her contributions. This is not a simple case of guilt or innocence. There's more here than meets the eye, and it's something I believe this courtroom should know before any sentence is handed down. Judge Carter's hand tightened on the gavel, his frustration barely contained. He could sense that this was more than just a plea for leniency. Marcus was holding back something, some crucial detail that might force him to reconsider. But the judge's pride got the better of him. He wanted to retain control, to maintain his authority in the face of this disruption. Mr. Hall, he replied, his voice cold and clipped. I do not appreciate interruptions in my courtroom. You know the procedure as well as anyone. If there are facts you wish to present, they should have been submitted earlier. Marcus's face remained impassive, yet there was a spark in his eyes. He didn't seem rattled by the judge's dismissal. Instead, he turned toward Alicia, a look of silent encouragement passing between them. Alicia straightened her posture, her expression shifting from one of resignation to quiet strength. This wasn't a look of defiance. It was something else entirely, something Judge Carter couldn't quite place. And then Marcus dropped a bombshell that sent a ripple through the courtroom. Miss Summers is not just a defendant, he said, his voice calm yet piercing. She is a decorated civil rights advocate, someone who has spent her life standing up for others, often at great personal risk. Her work in community outreach and advocacy has changed lives. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. But that's not all, Marcus added, his voice dropping to a near whisper. There are connections here, Your Honor. Connections that might make you reconsider your stance on this case. Judge Carter's heart skipped a beat. He didn't like surprises, especially not in cases he considered open and shut. Alicia's calm demeanor, Marcus's unexpected appearance, the weight of his words. All of it made Judge Carter feel as if he'd walked into a trap set by a truth he had overlooked. He could sense the gaze of the spectators shifting between him and Alicia, each one of them hungry for whatever revelation was about to come next. Judge Carter cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. And what, exactly, are these connections, Mr. Hall? He demanded, his voice laced with irritation. He was no longer in control of the narrative, and he didn't like it one bit. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, as if deciding how much to reveal without giving too much away. Your Honor, Miss Summers's life is deeply intertwined with the very principles this court is supposed to uphold. She's not just an advocate, she's someone who's influenced lives in ways you may not even realize. People in this city know her, respect her, and rely on her for guidance. Her work goes beyond any courtroom verdict. Judge Carter's eyes narrowed, but he held his tongue, his curiosity finally outweighing his frustration. He was intrigued, despite himself, by the mysterious aura that surrounded Alicia Summers. There was something about her story that seemed to transcend the cold, clinical details of a case file. And that unsettled him, challenging his black and white view of justice. The silence stretched, tension mounting with every passing second. Alicia looked up, meeting the judge's gaze with an intensity he hadn't expected. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet strength that seemed to speak volumes without words. For the first time, Judge Carter felt a flicker of doubt, a whisper in the back of his mind, urging him to look deeper. Yet, even with his curiosity piqued, his pride refused to let him bend too easily. "Mr. Hall," he said, his tone hardening, "I fail to see how Miss Summers's work in the community, however commendable, is relevant to her current offense. This court is here to determine guilt or innocence, not to serve as a platform for public figures." Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked as if he might push back. But instead he took a step back, folding his hands in front of him as he looked directly at Alicia. She gave him a small nod, as if signaling her approval to continue. Then finally she spoke. Her voice was soft yet resolute, filled with the calm authority that commanded the room's attention. "Your Honor," Alicia began, her gaze never leaving Judge Carter's, "I understand the seriousness of my offense. I came here today prepared to accept the consequences of my actions, no matter how severe. But there are things about my life that you don't know, things I never thought I'd have to explain in this setting. But if this is what it takes, I will tell my story." Judge Carter felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary case, and Alicia Summers was no ordinary defendant. In that moment, he knew that whatever came next would change not only her life, but also his own perspective, perhaps irrevocably. Alicia took a steadying breath, her eyes scanning the silent courtroom, and for the first time, Judge Carter saw a flicker of something deeper in her gaze, something painful yet resolute. She looked not at the judge, not at Marcus, but out toward the people watching, as though addressing each of them personally. Her voice, though quiet, held a depth that instantly captivated everyone in the room. "My life hasn't been easy," Alicia began, her tone unwavering. "Growing up, I learned early on that justice doesn't look the same for everyone. I watched people in my community suffer because they didn't have a voice, because the world judged them before they even had a chance to speak." She paused, her eyes narrowing with the weight of old memories. "I promised myself that one day I'd change that I'd become the person who could stand up for them, even if it cost me everything." Judge Carter's gaze hardened as he listened, but there was something in her words that gripped him, something uncomfortably close to the very ideals he thought he stood for. He hadn't expected a speech, he hadn't expected to care. But Alicia's words carried a sincerity that was impossible to ignore. Alicia continued, her voice steady yet filled with a quiet fire. "The people who come to me aren't criminals or troublemakers. They're people who want a chance to live with dignity, to walk down the street without fear. I've spent years working with community centers, with families, helping them understand their rights, fighting for their voices to be heard. And sometimes that means stepping in where others won't. I didn't expect to end up here," she said, her gaze meeting Judge Carter's. But maybe it was inevitable. The judge felt a wave of unease wash over him. He could feel the tension in the room, feel his own authority slipping as Alicia's words stirred something he couldn't control. He glanced at Marcus, who stood quietly, his face unreadable but clearly supportive. It was as if Marcus had known all along that this wasn't just about Alicia's case. It was about challenging something much larger. Alicia took a breath, and then, almost as if confessing a personal truth, she said, "I spent most of my life trying to do what's right. But sometimes doing the right thing comes at a cost. And that's how I ended up here. Not because I wanted to break the law, but because sometimes the law doesn't allow us to do what's truly just." Judge Carter's expression tightened. He didn't like the direction this was heading, and yet he found himself unable to interrupt her. He had been expecting defiance, maybe even resentment. But instead, Alicia was speaking with a calm that made her words impossible to dismiss. She wasn't excusing herself, wasn't blaming anyone else. She was simply stating facts that challenged everything he thought he knew. Marcus cleared his throat softly, drawing the judge's attention. "Your Honor," he said, "there's something you need to understand about Miss Summers. She doesn't come here seeking leniency. In fact, she's fully aware of what this sentence could mean for her future, for her career, and for everything she's built. but she also knows that her work has saved lives. People in this very city owe her their futures because she was willing to stand up for them, to fight for them. Alicia glanced at Marcus, her eyes softening briefly before she turned back to the judge. "I'm not asking for sympathy, Your Honor," she said quietly. "I'm asking for understanding. I came here today knowing that you might not see things the way I do, that you might look at me and see someone who doesn't fit your idea of what's right. But that doesn't change the truth." Judge Carter could feel his pulse quickening, a discomfort settling over him that he couldn't shake. Alicia's words were uncomfortably close to truths he'd spent his life ignoring. He'd seen countless defendants, each one with a story, yet he'd always prided himself on his ability to see past excuses and get to the facts. But this case was different. Alicia wasn't just defending herself. She was challenging the very system he believed in. The spectators sat in silence, caught in the tension that gripped the courtroom. Alicia's words had left an impact on them too. There was something about her story, about her willingness to risk everything for her beliefs, that made them question their own assumptions. It was clear that this case wasn't as simple as Judge Carter had first thought. And then, as if sensing the need to push just a bit further, Marcus spoke again. "Your Honor, I have evidence here, letters, testimonials from people who have been directly affected by Ms. Summers's work. These are people who've had their lives changed because she was willing to fight for them, often at great personal risk." Judge Carter felt a spark of irritation. He wanted to dismiss Marcus's words, to declare them irrelevant, but something held him back. He'd heard testimonies before, but he had the uneasy sense that these would be different, that they would make it harder for him to follow his usual black and white view of justice. Alicia continued, her voice softer now, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I never set out to be a hero," she admitted, her gaze distant. "I'm just someone who couldn't stand by and watch while others suffered. I don't expect everyone to understand, but I've seen too much to pretend that everything in life can be divided into simple categories of right and wrong." Judge Carter's throat felt tight as he listened. He'd built his career on the belief that the law was a clear, unwavering line. But Alicia's words cast a shadow over that certainty. For the first time, he found himself wondering if he'd been wrong, if his strict adherence to the rules had blinded him to the complexities of real lives. Alicia's voice softened, a hint of sadness creeping in. "Sometimes people like me end up in places like this not because we want to break the rules, but because we're trying to live by a different set of rules, ones that demand compassion, understanding, and fairness. I know it's not the easy way, and I know it doesn't always make sense to people who haven't lived through it." Her eyes met his, and there was a flicker of vulnerability there that made his chest tighten. Judge Carter felt a surge of conflicting emotions. He wanted to dismiss her words, to stick to his rigid interpretation of justice. But deep down, he knew that Alicia's story was chipping away at the foundation of his beliefs. He could feel the tension building, a silent battle between his desire for order and the unsettling realization that maybe, just maybe, his judgments had been too harsh, too unforgiving. Marcus stepped forward, placing a file on the judge's bench. "This," he said, "is a record of the people whose lives Alicia has impacted. I'd like to enter it into the record, Your Honor, not as evidence of her innocence, but as a testament to the kind of person she is. Because in this courtroom, character should matter." Judge Carter felt the weight of the file in his hands, as if it contained something far heavier than paper. He could feel the eyes of the spectators on him, the silent anticipation that filled the room. Alicia's story, Marcus's words, the quiet strength she radiated, it all left him questioning everything he thought he knew. He looked at Alicia, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not just a defendant, but a woman who had fought battles he could hardly imagine. A woman who had chosen a difficult path, risking her own future for the sake of others. And as he stared into her calm, unflinching gaze, he'd felt the lines between right and wrong blur, leaving him at a crossroads he never anticipated. For a long, charged moment, the courtroom was silent, each person waiting to see what would happen next, wondering if Judge Carter would stick to his principles or let himself be swayed by the truth he could no longer ignore. The silence in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, each person on the edge of their seat, awaiting Judge Carter's next move. He could feel all eyes on him, a silent yet palpable pressure weighing down on him as he grappled with the decision before him. His gaze flicked from the file of testimonials in his hands back to Alicia, who stood before him with her quiet resolve and unbreakable spirit. Every instinct told him to follow the rules, to rely on the law that had guided him throughout his career. Yet the unwavering strength in Alicia's words still echoed in his mind, making him question if that was truly the right path this time. Judge Carter cleared his throat, buying himself a moment to gather his thoughts, but the tension in the room only grew. Alicia's words about justice, about fairness, and about how the system often failed those who needed it most had stirred something deep within him. He had always believed in a world of black and white, where rules were rules and breaking them demanded punishment. But here stood a woman who seemed to embody shades of grey he'd never fully acknowledged. In his hands he held proof of her impact, a tangible record of the lives she had changed, people she had helped in ways he couldn't deny. Each page he thumbed through was a testament not only to her character, but to a kind of justice that went beyond the strict confines of the law. These people had seen her as a hero, a defender, someone who wasn't afraid to bend the rules if it meant doing what was right. And now it was up to him to decide whether to honor her bravery or uphold the rigid structure he trusted for so long. He glanced up at Marcus, who stood silently, his eyes steady yet filled with a pleading urgency. There was something about Marcus's silent support of Alicia that made the judge uneasy. It was clear that this wasn't just a routine case to him. Marcus saw something in Alicia, something valuable that he was willing to fight for until the very end. Judge Carter's fingers tightened around the file, and he felt a momentary flash of anger. Anger that he was being put in such a difficult position, that Alicia had forced him to confront his own beliefs in ways he hadn't expected. His authority was being questioned, his convictions challenged, and for the first time in his career, he felt a sliver of doubt. He looked back at Alicia, who returned his gaze with calm defiance, her eyes holding a quiet but unyielding strength. She wasn't afraid of what he might decide. She'd already faced so many battles that this one didn't seem to faze her. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. It made him realize that she wasn't just any defendant. She was someone who would keep fighting, no matter the outcome. The realization struck him hard, leaving him more conflicted than ever. Then, in a low, steady voice, Judge Carter addressed her. "Miss Summers, you're asking me to consider circumstances that are outside the law, outside the realm of what I'm here to uphold. You're asking me to go against everything I was trained to believe in, and yet you stand there telling me that sometimes rules need to be broken in the name of justice." His voice faltered for a moment, and he could hear the weight of his own words echoing back at him. But justice isn't just about fairness. It's about accountability. It's about making sure everyone answers for their actions. Alicia held his gaze, and for a moment he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, something he hadn't noticed before. It was as if she too was feeling the pressure of this moment, as if she understood the weight he bore. But then, with a slight lift of her chin, she regained her composure, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor," she replied, "I spent my life being held accountable. Every decision, every risk I've taken has come with consequences. But there's a difference between accountability and punishment. Sometimes justice demands that we look beyond the surface and see what lies beneath. I may have broken a rule, but that doesn't make what I did wrong." Her words hit him like a jolt, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was more than just a case. It was a test of his own beliefs, a challenge to the very core of what he thought he stood for. His gaze drifted to the spectators, and he could see the anticipation in their eyes, the silent hope that he might do something different, something unexpected. In that moment, Judge Carter found himself at the crossroads. He could follow the law, deliver a sentence, and move on as he'd always had, keeping his world of black and white intact. Or he could step outside his comfort zone, acknowledge the grey that Alicia had shown him, and consider a version of justice he had always dismissed. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air, and he could feel the pressure mounting, each second stretching out as he wrestled with the choice before him. He looked down at the file one last time, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Alicia's actions, her unwavering dedication to helping others, had forced him to question the very foundation of his beliefs. She wasn't a villain, and she wasn't an innocent bystander. She was someone who existed in that murky area between right and wrong, someone who understood that sometimes justice required more than blind adherence to the rules. And now he was being asked to make a choice, to either punish her for stepping outside the lines or to recognize the courage it took to do so. The courtroom held its breath, waiting as Judge Carter grappled with the weight of the moment, knowing that whatever decision he made, it would change more than just Alicia's life. It would redefine his own sense of justice forever.